Spirit of God, enable us to hear these words, your word, so that we might truly believe and truly live as your loving witnesses. To this end, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each one of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Reading from Luke's Gospel, chapter 12, verses 32 through 40. Let us listen for what the Spirit may be speaking to the church. Jesus says, "Do not be afraid, little flock, for it's your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give alms. Make purses for yourselves that do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven, where no thief can come and destroy, and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Be dressed and ready for action, and have your lamps lit. Be like those who are waiting for their master return from the wedding banquet, so that they may open the door for him as soon as he comes and knocks. Blessed are those slaves whom the master finds alert when he arrives. Truly I tell you, he will fasten his belt and have them sit down and eat, and he will come and serve them. If he comes during the middle of the night or near dawn and finds them so, blessed are those slaves. But know this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. There are basically three primary themes in this passage that we need to take a look at. One is fear. It begins, "Do not fear." The other is about possessions and faith. And the last is about being ready. The thing to know about the fear, I think, is to remember that here Jesus says, "I'm coming again, you better be ready, but do not fear." Because, did you notice the twist? When the master returns from the banquet, it is he who will do the serving. It's a complete turn of events. When I was young and was about 13 years old, it was the first time that I went out and got a job. And I was working for my mom's boss, who was a dentist. And as you know, almost every dentist that I know always has side work going on. He owned a number of properties, and so put me to work painting and working in his yards and doing all sorts of things. But as I left that very first time, my mom said, "When you are working," this was a piece of advice that I have kept with me my whole life, "even if the work is finished, don't sit down. Don't stand around. Find something else to do." I'm sure it sounds like somebody else has given that advice. When I was doing landscaping, when I was in college and thereafter, but when I was in college, I worked for a gentleman who had a landscaping firm, and he had the tendency of always showing up at our given breaks in the morning, the afternoon, or at lunch. And we always felt guilty when he would show up. Now, fortunately, he was a nice enough guy that said, "I'm only here to talk, so I don't," he did it on purpose because we weren't actually working, and then he could talk. But I always had in the back of my mind, whenever he would show up, this initial guilt feeling that I should be getting up and getting busy, because I didn't want him to think that I was somehow lazy, even though he never did. It was more about what was going on inside my head. This is a lesson that I continue to take with me, but it also has a downside. And the downside is that I don't sit down very well without feeling guilty. Over the last few years, sometimes about August, I get really sick. I've looked back in my calendar. Facebook reminded me, actually, for the last 5 years in a row. This time in August, I always get sick, which is it's when I usually decide I can't. My body is going to continue to go on. So the positive of this sense of fear. Now, why do I tell you this story? Well, I always have this sense that I need to be doing something, getting something done, and there was a bumper sticker that I saw that sort of encapsulates what I think this says about our faith. It said, "Jesus is coming, look busy. It is almost as if we feel like somehow we've got to be about the work of kingdom work all the time because Jesus is going to show up just about the time we decide to take a break and to sit down and rest. So when Jesus says, prepare for the kingdom, we hear, okay, we will get busy and keep working no matter what. But that impulse is based in many ways on fear and anxiety, that we need to be doing something, that our work somehow defines who we are. This past week, I saw a study that the fastest growing group of people who are committing suicide in the United States are aged 45 to 50, men. Why? Because this is the era where men are finding themselves out of work and have identified themselves with their work so fully that when they no longer have it, they feel as if they have no purpose. Helping people be able to sit and to be and recognize that we are more than what we do is at the heart of this passage. Jesus says, be faithful and wait, not faithful and busy, and faithful and working. Being able to be is a hard thing. It's a good thing to learn how to be bored and not always distracted. Now, I know that each one of us has their own natural anxiety, things about us that we get uptight about. I'm not talking about the things which there is a medical necessity for us to regulate, because we don't believe that prayer will overcome those things, that indeed we trust our mental health and physical health providers to provide appropriate medicine. What I'm talking about is the kind of anxiety that we have learned to kind of overcome with busyness or with work, or the ways we've learned to manage those kinds of things. I'm talking about those things that we do where we look for misdirection, so we don't have to really think about the things that might keep us up in the middle of the night. Now, many of you have heard me say I am an introvert, and one of my great anxieties is actually being with and in front of groups of people. You can laugh, it's okay, right? I'm used to it. Now, the way that I would deal with this anxiety for the longest period of time was to always have a book at my side, and I would bury myself in a book. But now things have changed, right? I can pull out my phone and go like this. And the good news is I'm not alone and everyone else around me. A couple of months ago, I was at a restaurant and went to the restroom. The door was locked, and so I stood there and waited. A gentleman who came, clearly younger than I was, came and tried the door, and I said, and then he realized I was waiting there, and I said, yes, now's the point where we pull out our phones so we don't have to talk. And he laughed and he said, oh, I'm glad it's not just my generation too. Which not only made me feel better, but also made me feel bad because he thought I was so much older than me. Now, I heard a story this week, though, that gets at some of this anxiety and fear. There's a pub in England that has figured out how to create community. Now, some of you might have grown up with the television show Cheers and remember it, right? Where you went to everybody knows your name. Today, if you go places, everybody's face is down even if they're by themselves. Well, this restaurant figured out that if you put aluminum foil around the inside of the building, they could disrupt the cell signals and the Wi-Fi signals, and everybody there actually has to talk to one another. I mean, the owner really said, as I was listening to the story, that he was so disturbed by the lack of community that existed around him, that pubs used to be at the heart. Not that we need to start creating more pubs in order to do this, but the idea was that when somebody goes to the restroom, right, the first thing we do if we're by ourselves is pull out the phone. Now, maybe some of you don't do this, but I'm telling you that lots and lots of people do this, and I have been guilty as well. It's an easy out. We don't have to be physically present, and we don't have to deal with our anxiety. It fits within my anxiety quite well. But the truth is, this fear, the fear of other people, the fear that we have going on, that we can overcome this if we stop for a moment and live in that anxiety for what it is, and particularly the need for human connection. The need for human connection can be a great antidote to people who are living in fear, unless the people with whom you are connecting are all acting out of fear. And Jesus says, do not fear. Do not fear, little flock. It sounds a little condescending as we hear this, but the truth is, it's coming from a place of deep compassion. Because Jesus knows that within each one of us, that fear resides in such a way that it will enable us to work, it will keep us from being able to live and love as we're supposed to. Our worst decisions in life come out of being driven by fear and or anxiety. And that's why Jesus begins with do not fear. Not because there's nothing to fear. He does not say there is nothing to fear. What he says is do not fear. And I think on some level it's about getting our priorities straight. Some of you might remember the proverb that says the beginning of all knowledge is what? Anybody remember? The first part of that line. Something is the beginning of all knowledge, or the basis and the foundation of it. Fear of the Lord. Which sounds a little weird because we want to say, well, God is loving and just and kind. And what is this fear about? Well, it's about awe. It's about where our fear ought to be. It's about our awe. But think about how many things we are fearful of in the world. And the things we are fearful of become the thing that ends up at the center of our lives. The powerful say you should fear them. The great armies of the world have always said you should fear us. The great empires of the world have always sought to induce fear. And I forgot to put it up this morning, but that's what the cross was all about. The cross was a symbol of fear to use over people so that they would chase after every Messiah that came along and acted like sheep. When our priorities are straight, our fear is for God alone. If we fear God alone, then we don't have to fear the little gods of our age. If we believe on some level that God is in control of all the things around us, it's not a horrible thing to leave our phone in our pocket and maybe talk to the person that's next to us. That's self-revealing. I'm not preaching at anyone right now. I don't know if you're anything like me, right? I go to I love when the self-checkout line is open because then I don't have to interact with people. But I have forced myself to actually go through the line. It's actually a justice issue that's inside, right? Because the fewer people they have fewer human beings they have in the lines, the fewer they have to hire. The more of us that go to those, the fewer people who are employed. It's not only that, it's about connecting with the person across from us. If we believe, though, that God is in control, the things that are fear and gripping us have not the last word. The truth is, in our own lives, there is much that we can control. And when we're fearful, we often learn and overprogram on the things we can control. But we can't control the actions of other people. We can't control things beyond what happens to us and our health. Up to a point, we can take care of our health. But the truth is, and we all know this to be true, you can do everything right. You can exercise and not smoke, and you can be like Jim Fixx, who drops of a heart attack as a marathoner. They are beyond our control. The health of the people we love is beyond often our control. There are so many things that we all could sit here and list that are beyond our control and that cause us fear. But the thing we have to remember is that these aren't the things that should be driving us on a day-to-day basis. And if we do, it can lead us to despair. And then we just give up waiting altogether. This past week I was talking, some of you know that we did a funeral, or I did the funeral, the eulogy for Dornice Westfall. And I want to give thanks, while I'm thinking about it, to Cope Brilliant Presbyterian Church. They were fantastic hosts for the family. There was probably close to over 350 people who were at the funeral, so we would not have been able to fit them in this room. And I was talking to Reverend Crumpton afterward and talking about how things were bad. And he said he agreed with me. He said, but I remember ultimately who's in control. And I thought, well, he didn't share it in such a way as to shame me as pastor, but I laughed. And then he laughed and said, sometimes these are the kinds of things that we have to remind ourselves. If we believe God's in control, the things that are as bad as they are right now, they've been this bad and they've been worse before. And as he said, I don't think they're, and you probably heard this line before, I don't think things are any worse than they've ever been. I just think there's more cameras recording and more news outlets. And so we have to not turn them off, but remember that they don't have the last word. And for those people who feel deeply, the natural empaths in our lives, these days can be even more anxiety producing. So remember, it is not a crime to self-care. In fact, it's sometimes a radical political act for you to take care of yourself and step back. So do not fear. Jesus says, do not fear, and then he says, sell your possessions. Did you catch that shift? Well, the one thing I didn't talk about was the anxiety about money. Money, we all need it. We need it personally in our homes, in our families. We need it in the church. And to say, well, just don't fear and don't worry about it. And lo and behold, he says, sell your possessions. I think what he's getting at is probably a challenge about priorities, not necessarily prescriptive. Because if you'll notice the first church of Acts and the people who surrounded Jesus, there were still people who were wealthy following Jesus. It was always the people who had their priorities in the wrong place where Jesus had to say, nope, you need to get rid of it. The American dream has become about accumulation. Or for some folks, it's just about making sure that there's money at the end of the month. What I'm talking about is this chase of money. And relinquishing our possessions is this weird place to be in. And I thought, well, how do we talk about this in a faithful way? And I remembered an image that has always stuck with me. Some of you might remember the Professor Randy Fauci. He ended up publishing a book, ended up on Oprah, called The Last Lecture. And he was a professor who had contracted a rare but fatal illness, but still had the opportunity to give his last lecture as a professor. And in this lecture, he talked about the importance of life, and it is still one of the most powerful books of someone facing their own mortality and recognizing what is most important in life. And one of those was the image about getting our possessions straight. And he tells a story when he was younger, before he had kids, before he was married. His sister had a son, and he went over to pick up his nephew to go out for the day and spend time, uncle and nephew together. And he pulls up in his brand new Volkswagen, and it has the rag top, and he has it down, and he's standing out front. And he tells the story that his sister had her back to him, and she's lecturing her son about the importance of making sure that he doesn't make a mess in his uncle's brand new car. But then she notices something, is that her son is looking and laughing about something going on behind her. And she turns around and sees him standing there with a can of Pepsi, pouring into the back seat. And he said, I did that because I wanted to remind him that it was just a possession. I wanted to remind my sister that at the end of the day, they were leather seats so they could wipe off. So at the end of the day, that it still was nothing more than a tool. It was a possession. And that he was more important, and he was just trying to emphasize that. So as careful as we try to do, it's important, I suppose at the heart of it, what she said, what he was saying at it, was that relationships are more important than any possession that we have. Notice when Jesus says, do not fear, he does not say, do not fear little lamb. He says, do not fear little flock. What he's saying is we don't face any of this alone. Or even more importantly, we can't. We cannot be in relationship with other people. So we might be the fearful little lambs, but we're powerful in more ways when we're the fearful little flock, learning not to be fearful together. And now the last point out of this is this concept of being ready. If you read what Jesus has said, it says for 2,000 years, we better make sure that every moment, every day, we are ready. We must remain ever vigilant. You've heard that these days, right? We have to always be on guard. We have to expect the unexpected. We have to always be ready for action, to always be prepared. I was a Boy Scout. And the truth of all of these sayings is they're all lies. We can't always be prepared. We can be more prepared than we would be otherwise. We can't always be vigilant. We can't always be on guard. We can't. Otherwise, we will be a mess, psychologically and otherwise. So what's Jesus saying? Is it just a trite saying that said always be ready? Or is it something else? I think what he's trying to get at is that he's calling us to figure out how just simply to be consistent. To be and be consistent. Not to worry about the grand thing we might do for Jesus Christ, but instead, simply, as they used to say, tend our garden. I spent a lot of time yesterday, in fact, so much so that it's hard for me getting up and out of the chair, pulling weeds. Now, weeds are easy to grow. But I remember growing a garden, which I hope to do next year, and we'll see how that goes. And the thing about it is that all you can really do is prepare the soil and put the seeds in and work to pull the weeds, and then you have to wait and trust. Sometimes it grows and sometimes it doesn't. Our potatoes were a disaster last year. This year we didn't do anything, and sunflowers and potatoes grew in the backyard. So there you go. But the truth is, it reminds us that what we can be responsible for and following in Jesus is worshiping together, is serving other people, is being served, is learning about our faith and praying together. Those are the things in which we have control over, and that's what I believe Jesus is calling us to do. When he says that we have to wait, I think what he's saying is that we have to look forward to the time when there will be no more injustice, where there'll be no more hunger, where there'll be no more hurt, where there'll be no more tears. And if we stay focused on those things, we will look to the places where we can be part of ending them in our own time, knowing that the work will always just be beyond us. But we are called to do what we can. Keeping the most important things in front of us is the goal. Instead of focusing on the highlights of the moment, be consistent across the lifetime. And that is seldom honored until we are gone. But the truth is that it takes just consistent action. Now, I'm not big on self-revealing, but I'm going to share something that I've been up to over the last 5 years. Is that I have, since I was a little kid, I was always fascinated with, this should make you laugh, the World's Strongest Man contest. I don't know if you've ever seen these weirdly large men who are throwing, and women, by the way, they just haven't televised women yet, throwing around stones and tires and picking up refrigerators. And I would watch this stuff forever. About 5 years ago, a friend of mine from seminary actually started doing it. So what did I do? I started training 5 years ago. Not that I was thinking I was going to get to any sort, but it just seemed like the kind of thing that I could get behind, and for the first time I started doing it. So I've learned a couple of things, and I have a ton more to learn, but I've learned to enjoy it at 6 o'clock in the morning when I go to the gym. So I've learned a couple of important lessons as I've hurt myself severely over the last 5 years. The first one is don't compare your journey with anyone else's. Our genetics are different. Some people are going to get strong really fast and some people aren't. Don't worry about it. Just be consistent. When you try to compare yourself with others, you're bound to do more than you actually are physically capable of doing, and that will lead you to hurting yourself in some way, physically or emotionally. And yes, my back is still getting better. But the other thing is, it takes time. It's like any craft in life, that it requires of you to spend time in repetition and to trust that the consistent action over the long arc will begin to show results. And then at some point it becomes a habit. But doing the same exact thing over and over again will not lead you to growing in the life of faith. The other one that's important is to listen to other people, but to listen to the right other people, the ones who have done what you would like to do, and other folks who want to lift you up. Don't listen to the negative folks. And I will find the most amazing thing I have found as I've gotten to know other people who are doing this, is they're some of the most tolerant people in the world. They're at the forefront of some justice issues and welcome. They don't care whether you're doing 2 pounds or 2,000 pounds. Nobody really does that yet. They're still supporting. Imagine us doing that with one another in our journey of faith. And the other one is, don't believe everything you read from other folks. And listen to your own body. When you are spent, when you are worn out, when you are tired, when you need a break, take a retreat. Pray. Center yourself. I'm still working on this analogy, but I think there's an awful lot there, not only in this, but in some of the crafts which folks in this room are involved in. It is much like the journey of faith. We're called to pray and to study and to worship and to serve over and over again. Not just going through the motions, but with an eye and a hope towards growth. And what that means for us and where the end of that journey is, we will not know until the resurrection. But the truth is, it is about giving ourselves a break, but challenging us along the way. Do not fear, little flock. Be ready, but do not fear. Do not fear the return. Do not fear what can ultimately happen. The good news is, as I said at the funeral this week, no matter what, we are in God's hands. And that is good news, even if the news of the day is not. Amen.